Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to session 2 of Architecture and the Luminous Ground. I want to apologize for last week. I was quite ill and I wasn't able to finish what we started last week. But this week, inshallah, we'll do exactly that. So I promised last week that we would move on to the second lecture. The second lecture now is really a continuation of the first week, inshallah. The title of this one is The Human Being is a Microcosm. And it's a continuity from what we did before, in the sense that last week we covered the topic of the luminous ground in terms of nature. So we saw that underpinning the very fabric of reality, existence, and the natural world is the luminous ground, or the ground of being itself. And we saw that in the beauty of nature, in the glory of nature, we encounter the face of God in all things. And we also discussed the same issue of discovering the luminous ground and the face of God also in human artifacts. And we said that all things are very much alive because all things participate in life, given that all are given life by the divine name Al-Hayy, the living one. And so theoretically, of course, that means all things, even things man-made, can be occasions and signs for traces of the divine names or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's signs in the world. But in order for that to happen, in order for the artifacts or human artifacts or human creations to be of that type of quality, to be able to reflect the face of God in things, they have to be created, designed, molded, crafted, following a set of patterns, order, harmony, and principles as those found in the natural world. I didn't talk as much about the human being and the role of the human being in this one, but I'll try to shed a bit more light on that in this session, inshallah. So, Bismillah. Now, if one were to ask oneself what happened exactly with this transition or this shift, why is it that we somehow possess this remarkable understanding of the luminous ground in traditional cultures, and why has it somehow fundamentally disappeared from our modern culture? In order to do that, really, particularly its disappearance from Western culture, and then the transmission of that kind of attitude and that sensibility to the rest of the world through colonization and globalization, we find ourselves as Muslims also participating in this inability to really perceive the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the world, and also unable to continue producing the kind of beauty in art and architecture that we once were able to do before the modern world. And the answer to that really is there has been a fundamental reorientation. An reorientation or a shift from a worldview of traditional cultures or the Middle Ages into the modern worldview. And this has to be really put in the foreground in our understanding in order to understand how it has traumatized our bodies, our mind, our souls, our hearts, and how it has rendered us unable to connect with the spiritual reality of the world around us. It's not so much that we live in a different age than they did. A lot of people, especially modern sensibility, will say the only difference between the Middle Ages and our age is that they lived in a different age, a different time period. It's actually something much more radical than that. We don't even seem to inhabit the same world. We don't inhabit the same understanding, the same conceptualization of the relationship between things in the world. This fundamental reorientation happened a few centuries ago. We're not going to get into that in detail. That would require a long seminar in philosophy. But it is important to foreground that those who built the medieval town that we admire so much, those who produced the great mosques, the beautiful towns, churches, and streets that we so admire in a lot of pre-modern architecture, they inhabited an entirely different world from the world of our own. And so part of restoring some of that beauty in this world is to recover the cosmology, to recover the worldview, to recover that world in which they inhabited. These two images here are quite telling in the sense that they juxtapose the beauty and harmony and sensibility of traditional architecture, at least in Europe, with the kind of modernist and postmodern architecture that's quite common today. Believe it or not, the buildings on the right have won awards as great examples of architecture. So how did we go from the images on the left to the image on the right? It's not just a shift in architectural style. It's actually fundamentally a shift in worldview, a shift in cosmology, a shift in philosophy, a shift in religious, spiritual, epistemological understandings of the world. In an important series of studies, the American historian of the Middle Ages, Edward Krantz, argued that the transition from ancient consciousness or pre-modern consciousness to modern consciousness is a qualitative transition from one world to another, in the sense that we no longer inhabit the same world. So when we look at the stars, when we look at the trees, when we look at nature, we no longer see the same things that they saw in the Middle Ages. According to Krantz, for Aristotle, the soul is somehow all beings, which is why it can know all things and know them in such a way that in what is without matter, what thinks and what is thought are the same. And essentially what this means is that there's some kind of an ontological continuity between what happens in our mind, within us, within ourselves, and what happens in the actual world itself. The ancients, he says, experienced an awareness that was open to what lay around them. And they experienced no sense of this kind of radical dichotomy between their own awareness and everything else. What they found in their own minds or intellect was of like character with much of what was outside it. Let me explain that with an example. Krantz articulates the kind of self that once inhabited, or we once inhabited, as it were, the ancient self of this kind of cosmology or ontology, as the extensive self. And what he means by the extensive self is a self that is somehow extended into the world and part of a single continuous realm of being. Here, the soul is a microcosm of the macrocosm, and the cosmos is the soul writ large. Today, we often tend to think that myself, my soul, or myself ends at the tip of my skin, or my tip of my fingers, at the edge of my skin. We tend to think of ourselves as creatures that inhabit a body, but whose consciousness, whose awareness, whose sense of self is also contained within this body. This is a very novel, very new understanding of the human being. In fact, in many ancient cultures, the self did not end at the edge of my skin, but rather it extended to include the entire world. Our soul is something, though embodied in a body, it belongs essentially and is linked with a wider realm of reality that binds all things together. So if we look at the example of this wonderful garden in Cambridge, it's called the Sunken Garden at Clare College. It's a very beautiful garden. I've spent many, many years on that bench on the left and the right, sometimes sitting beneath those two apple trees in the back. It's a lily pond in the middle, and there are York dry stone walls on the edges of that sunken garden with flowers surrounding the sunken garden. On the edge of the garden itself, there is a hedge, a high hedge. So if you're inside the garden, you can't really see beyond that hedge, and you can't really see beyond those higher trees in the distance. And so when one enters into this garden, as it were, one feels a sense of enclosure, as it were. The only openness is towards the sky itself. Now, if I were to enter into this garden, that's a crude image. I do apologize for my very basic drawing skills, but there's an image of an individual, let's say you and I, entering into this garden there. We often tend to think that myself is some kind of a bubble that immediately surrounds my body. But as soon as you enter into this garden, as soon as you step through the gate into the garden, one immediately senses the harmony of the design, the soothing effect of the greenery, the perfect proportions and symmetry. One smells, of course, and senses the aroma of the flowers. One takes in the entire experience as a whole, simultaneously within a fraction of a second. If that is the case, if we are affected, moved, transformed, changed immediately by our encounter with things at a pre-reflective level, this suggests that myself is not a bubble enclosed within my body, but rather that myself is actually a large bubble, as it were, that extends as far as my senses can perceive, and even further. And what that means is, if I look up to the stars or the sky, for example, on an evening night, and I'm deeply, profoundly moved by the stars in the sky, or I'm moved by the luminous moon, what that suggests is myself, or my experiential bubble, extends far beyond just my skin. It takes in the entire world itself. And what that suggests is that as we walk through and experience the world, our self is extended across the entire landscape, sky, as far as our eye can actually see, and even beyond, which means that essentially my experiential bubble, or my field of perception, is as extended as the world itself. And so to live and inhabit in a world like this, spontaneously, at a very profound and primordial level, is to live a self that is quite extensive, and not enclosed or intensive or concentrated within my own bodily existence. And so that means that the kind of knowledge this extensive self produces, the kind of knowledge it encounters, is the kind of knowledge that Krantz called conjunctive, in the sense that the knower and the known are united as one, because perception is happening across a field that is a continuum. Things are known in an immediate manner because one is somehow conjoined or united with it. Now, that comes to an end with the modern age. But in traditional cultures, there was a whole philosophy and epistemology and cosmology surrounding this particular way of understanding the world. In the introduction to Mafatih al-Ghaib, Sadr al-Din al-Qunawi, a very famous Muslim metaphysician, makes the important observation, which is a metaphysical principle simultaneously, that the soul knows what is in the world because it already contains the world within it in potentia. So when we enter into a garden like this, for example, and I see the trees, I see the plants, I see the stones, the pond, the water, the sky, the reason why I'm able to immediately perceive them is because I'm already connected to them at a deep and profound level. That as a microcosm, as a small image of the entire cosmos, I already contain all the attributes, all the qualities of all the things in the world. Another way of looking at it is to say that while the divine names manifest or are manifest and dispersed across the entire cosmos, the human being is the only creature that contains all the divine names within itself. And all the things in the cosmos are also contained within the human being, such that when I perceive something external to myself, a tree, a moon, a plant, a paddock, I'm actually perceiving something that already has or already exists within me. This idea of correspondence or munasaba is a very interesting principle of traditional cosmology. It means basically that the human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm, or a mirror image of the entire universe. And so when perceiving things external to myself, I'm actually perceiving their external manifestation of a reality that already exists within me. Why? Because human existence was seen as a microcosm, as something that is suspended or nested within a pattern of correspondences or structural resonances that link the human order to the divine order through sympathetic bonds, raqa'iq. And so imagine, for example, a thread, a subtle thread that connects you to every single thing in creation, and a thread that connects you to the divine name simultaneously in creation. We exist within a circle, within a circle, within a circle, within a circle. And within each circle, there's a correspondence, a relationship correspondence, or structural resonances, such that when I perceive the natural world around me, I'm perceiving the earthly manifestation of their equivalents in another level of being. And at that level, other level of being, those are also articulations, manifestations of the same realities at another level of being, until you get all the way up to the highest level of the divine order. So this theory of nested realities, as it were, or structural resonances, to what bind us and connect us to the things around us, and then ultimately to the divine reality. William Chittick, in one of his works, mentions the work of a Chinese scholar, Tu Weiming. According to him, the cosmos is perceived as an unfolding of an all-embracing continuous creativity in which all modalities are organically connected. It's another way of saying basically that the fabric of reality is one. It's in a process of perpetual creation, khalq kun fayakun, faster than a blink of an eye, and that everything is interconnected because of the everything consists of, or everything is a trace of the divine names, which constitute the fabric of reality. Reality, therefore, consists of a dynamic energy field in which all parts of the cosmos mutually interact in a spontaneously self-generating life process. The images here on the right are quite interesting, that show the kind of structural resonances and correspondences at a purely material and physical reality. On the left-hand side, there are neurons with synaptic connections. On the right-hand side, there's a cosmic web or cluster of galaxies. And we can see at different scales of reality, from the level of the neurons in our brains to the level of the interconnected cluster of galaxies. Same patterns govern different levels of reality. This is purely at the physical level. If we talk about the relationship between different ontological levels, it's quite similar. Each level corresponds to a level above it, and a level above it, and a level above it. And as long as we align ourselves with the intrinsic patterns of the Fitra that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has deposited in the natural order of things, we connect ourselves to the higher orders. And insofar as we ignore these patterned relationships, these nested relationships of structural resonances from the lowest reality to the highest, we can disconnect ourselves from it. And so while human beings are part of this cosmic web, our minds and consciousness make us unique in that we are able to probe the transcendental anchorage of our nature. And that means we have, of course, a divine principle within us, the spirit, the ruh, that allows us to connect to that anchor that links us to the transcendental world, and thereby achieve a sympathetic accord with the myriad of things in nature. Again, this is reiterating the very fundamental idea that we are somehow, at some level, interconnected. And this is what gives us a sense of deep awe towards nature and the natural world. The Quran speaks of it as mizan or nizam, order, harmony in the cosmos. It often asks the reader to look once and twice and three times to see if they can come across or discern or discover any disharmony. And of course, the answer is an absolute no. One way to look at the divine injunctions and commands of the Quran, or the reason behind them, is the example of the salat. In the same way that the heliotrope, the sunflower here, follows the sun as it moves across the sky, there is this kind of intrinsic sympathy between the sunflower, its yellow color, it's nourished from the light of the sun itself. At the center of the sunflower, of course, is this wonderful Fibonacci series spiral that's found everywhere in nature. The flower follows the course of the sun across the sky. It moves literally during the day following the sun. Another way of saying it is to say the flower follows a pattern or is aligned with a cosmic order that nourishes its very existence and allows it to flourish. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to pray, it's not so much because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is imposing a burden on us that He needs from us. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need our prayers, but rather the prayer is a remarkable moment in which we escape from the everyday pattern of our life, which is chaotic. We escape from the everyday sense of calculative instrumental time. We experience time on a daily basis in a very artificial way. We escape from the experience of space and gestural movements that are very mechanical, driven by desires and driven by motivations and driven by greed. What Salat asks us to do is temporarily, for 5 times a day, to realign ourselves with a cosmic order and a cosmic rhythm. So we escape the calculative instrumental time of the watch to insert ourselves into a cosmic time. Our prayer, of course, is regulated by the movement of the sun across the sky, just like the sunflower, and our fasting is also regulated by the moon. A lot of our ibadat are regulated by divine rhythms in nature. So we escape this everyday rhythm in order to insert ourselves into an eternal rhythm of time. Also, we escape the gestural movements of snatching with our hand and plotting with greed and ambition, moving our bodies toward in certain ways that are quite mechanical and for all sorts of different mixed motivations and reasons. What we do is in prayer is we follow a pre-configured set of movements that are perfectly designed in order to align with the movement of creation itself, and at the same time align with in order to maximize our spiritual potential for ascent. Of course, the salat is the ascent of the believer, and in our physical movements downwards, we spiritually ascend. Yeah, and so the movements of salat put us in sympathetic accord with things. Some of the scholars even say that the standing gesture, the standing movement of salat, qiyam, is the quintessential human position. Of course, there are 4 kingdoms in nature: the human kingdom, the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, and the mineral kingdom. The standing position corresponds to the human position. The bowing corresponds to the movement of animals. The sujood corresponds to the horizontal movement of plants. And the julus position corresponds to the stability and stillness of stone. And so in the prayers itself, there is this kind of remarkable realignment with the divine order. So turning back to Krant's work on the transition from the ancient to the modern, he warns us not to think of the ancient way of seeing things as some kind of a foolish thinking. Rather, it's something quite radical. It's a very different way of knowing things. In our mind, we know things out there by having ideas of them in here. Today, when I tend to think about I know something external to myself, it's because I have an idea of it in my mind. And we've kind of fallen into this kind of solipsism where beyond this, my own skin, there's a world out there that my relationship to the world is not entirely clear, how I know things, against the ancient position in which sensation and intellection lead to conjunction and unity with things. We find a dichotomy between the mind and what is outside it, between meanings and things. This is what's happened lately. The shift to this kind of modern cosmology where the human being seems to be a creature that is completely cut off from the external world out there. The first thing I ask myself when the first thing we tend to do is to ask, how do I know, for example, that a tree is beautiful? People often even doubt their experience. It's a very bizarre thing to ask because at some deep and profound level, we already know that a tree, that we're deeply connected to a tree, or we're deeply connected to a meadow, or we're deeply connected to a river and the beauty of nature. We already feel the conjunction and union at some level. But somehow the modern cosmology has taken over and has trumped our immediate experience, almost our fitraic experience. And through some kind of cerebral gymnastics, or modern ideology, which is fixation on rational thinking, we tend to trump any sensed feeling of connection with the world with irrational skepticism about our ability to know things external to ourselves. Rather than the ancient extensive self, as we spoke about earlier, a self that is open to the world around it, we find a move to an intensive self in the modern age, a universe of meaning separated by a dichotomy from the world of things. So, whereas in the pre-modern period, the self was understood to be something extended beyond the physical body, that our own soul within us, our own reality, and the world soul somehow, or the reality within and reality without are somehow deeply connected. We now inhabit a world in which the intensive self occupies this physical body, and with its own ideas somehow contained within our brain, completely disconnected from the external world. And so, against an ancient reason, an ancient type of thinking, which is primarily a vision of what is, we find ourselves now moved towards a situation in which reason is understood as a coherence of ideas or thoughts in our own mind. Whereas previously, what it meant to exercise aql was to achieve a certain vision of unity of what reality actually is. Today, we find ourselves, when we say that a rational thought is actually nothing but an internal coherence of ideas within my own mind. So rational thinking no longer involves an extension beyond the self towards understanding the intrinsic nature of things, al-ashya' kama hiya, but rather it now seems to just involve logical coherence within my own mind. And what this leads to is the kind of very dangerous suspended self, as it were. The intensive self, the self turned inwards, produces disjunctive knowledge, not knowledge not knowledge that entails a union of the known and the knower, but rather a kind of knowledge that where there's a split between the knower and the known, between meaning and things, and that somehow the only relationship between things is if I can establish some kind of internal coherence within my own mind. And so knowledge now lacks all immediacy. And we end up with this kind of self that is suspended in a meaningless existence. Edward Munch, the expressionist artist in the 20th century, once walking with friends at sunset, had this overwhelmingly bizarre experience in which he said, I stood there trembling with anxiety at sunset, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. In this painting, he really articulates the suspended self that lives in a meaningless existence and the anxiety associated with it. Now, this modern Western way of thinking about things, which has now become global, and it is important to point this out and explain it, because we as Muslims now have become as modern as everyone else to a large extent. And if we ask ourselves why we can no longer see the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in nature, when he says, سَنُرِيهُمْ آيَاتُنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ أَنَّهُ الْحَقُّ. We shall show them our signs upon the horizon within themselves. When we're no longer able to see the trees as signs of God and the sun as a sign of God, it's largely because we are quintessentially modern individuals defined by modern subjectivity. And to a large extent, we are intensive selves, partially suspended in a meaningless existence. And we really need to seriously find ways out of this if we are to really reconnect with the Quran and with the spiritual reality of the Quran constantly urges us and encourages us to discover in the world. And so this kind of Western mode of thinking is different from and even alien to all previous cultures, all previous thought. But there's nothing normative about it. There's nothing normal about it. And the shift is not just a change in thinking, but a change in experiencing the world. Today, we can no longer experience the world as it once was. Sacred theophanies, objects luminous with divine presence. And so Krantz concludes and he says, the thrust of my argument is not that there were different theories about the same seeing and knowing, but rather that there were different seeings and knowings. It's not like we have a different theory about seeing and knowing. It's just that we don't see and know the same things anymore. We've lost a dimension of reality. Of course, with the reductionism of science, where everything is reduced to the physical plane, and our knowledge of the world is reduced to a purely rational approach to reality, we lose a fundamental dimension of reality and the world around us. And so we end up with this, what is often referred to as a Cartesian dualism. We end up with this subjectivism, where we stand on this side of our reality, the inner subjective world of the mind, and the world out there somehow exists, objective outer reality, but there seems to be a huge gulf between them. The biggest questions in recent modern thinking have always been, how can we know the reality of the external world around us? Now, no one's denying that there is some kind of a subject-object relationship. We are aware that I'm something here and there's an external world out there to a certain extent. But what I am suggesting here, at least, is that this is not the most immediate way in which we experience the world. Think about it from your own experience, really. You go about your business every day, whether you're in prayer or when you're walking to work or whether you're traveling. On a day-to-day experiential level, we are immersed unreflectively in the world around us. It's only when we start thinking, when I start exercising my rational mind, I start thinking about myself as a subject, and then the world out there as some kind of an object opposed to me somehow. But in most immediate immersive experiences of our day-to-day realities in the world, there is no dichotomy. And so what that suggests is that beneath that kind of thinking of subject-object, there is something, a more fundamental type of experience that's truthful to the reality of the world itself. Let me give you an example. You step out of the car and you're immediately in the presence of a beautiful landscape. In a split second, your most immediate response and interaction is pre-reflective or unreflective, immersive, immediate, and holistic. It's a one whole total experience that overwhelmed you. It's only later when I start thinking about this experience that I'm consciously aware that when I had that experience, I was a subject looking at a landscape. In the immediacy of the experience, we're immersed as one with the world around us. And most of our experiences are of this type, which means that if I really truly want to understand how we experience the world, we have to really start recovering the fact that there is an integral entwinement of self and world that is basic to our being. And modern philosophy, with its rational approach, this reflective second-order experience splits the subject off from objects and from other subjects around us. And so we end up with this subjectivism, this world in which an intrinsically meaningless objective realm is called nature is somehow separated epistemically from isolated value-bestowing self-certain subjects. And so it needs to then be mastered through more refined epistemological approaches. But there is beneath all that, as I said, a primordial level of experience. We are not denying here the reality of the subject-object relation, but rather pointing out that our experience of this subject-object relation derives from and so presupposes a more fundamental level of experience. I'm not saying that we don't, at some level, are not aware that I'm a subject here and that the world is an object out there, but this awareness of my distinction from the world is a second-order experience. Beneath it is a more fundamental, more primordial level experience, a kind of experience that I have more often than the reflective one. And so the reflective experience of subject-object distinction between myself and the world derives from this fundamental experience, a primordial modality of engaged existence in which self and the world are united rather than divided. When you walk through nature, we're immediately connected to the very reality and beauty of nature itself. I don't think about that connection. I don't deduce it. I don't arrive at it through some kind of calculated logical process. The moment I step out of a car and start walking in nature, I'm immediately connected. I immediately start relaxing, calming down. I immediately feel the way in which the natural world around me realigns my existence and my reality. In fact, the less thought, the less reflection, the less thought, conscious thinking, the better, because that allows that kind of connection to intensify. And so we are aware in our day-to-day experiences that there is this more fundamental level of experience, but we don't necessarily draw the logical conclusion from it or the natural conclusion from that. And so looking at the world, I may see the world as isolated objects, but beneath that we know and experience the world of isolated objects as deeply interconnected. This primordial level of experience in which the self and the world are united must be the starting point of any description of human experience that seeks to do justice to what such experience is really like. It is prior to thought or reflection. It is in a realm of experience we might refer to as feeling or the heart. Now, let me explain what that means in a minute, because it might sound like I'm suggesting something quite controversial. Modern thought has denigrated the heart as a faculty. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see that reason has been glorified since the Enlightenment as a faculty of knowledge that grants us access to the world, of truths that are objective. It grants access to ideas that are clear, understanding, concepts that we can manipulate and through which we construct all sorts of different rational systems. And eventually reason is what allows us to arrive at truth. The heart has been denigrated. The heart is considered the realm of subjective experience. And when we say subjective experience, even we today tend to speak of subjective experience as something that's unreliable. When someone speaks something in a conversation, you may accuse them of being too subjective, i.e. Not rising to the level of an objective description of something. And therefore, when you accuse them of being subjective, you're really telling them that what they're saying is inaccurate, it's clouded by emotions that are unreliable. It's clouded by feelings instead of clear understanding. It's clouded by a certain mood, instead of a clear concept. And the heart ultimately only gives a certain kind of experience, but it doesn't allow us to achieve any degree of truth. Now, this is a catastrophic distinction to elevate reason and denigrate the heart. We know, of course, in our Islamic psychospiritual model of the self, that the heart is at the center of a unique type of perception and a unique type of knowledge that is precise and objective. And we need to recover in the modern world the capacity of the heart. In Islamic cosmology, the heart is a center of perceiving the divine reality, ultimately, of course. And so our connection to the world is deeply felt, it's deeply sensed, it is real, it is objective. And it's an objective relation between the ultimate nature of a living thing, whether it's a living being or a living artifact, and the ultimate nature of myself, the inner self, the I, the Fitraic self. And so if you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, whichever way you look at the diagram, we cannot reduce the human being to just a body that senses things and a mind that thinks through things. If the body and the senses grant us access to the physical world, and the mind grants us access to the world of ideas, the heart grants us access to the spiritual reality of things. Al-Ghayb, Alam al-Ghayb. Each one of these is a faculty of knowledge within us, and each one grants access to a different world. And so if we consider the heart as nothing but a subjective faculty that grants access to only wishy-washy tree-hugging feelings, then we're denying the heart its intrinsic capacity, which the Quran gives to it, to perceive the divine reality. Al-Qalb. We have to restore all three in balance with one another. We may call this perception of our intrinsic connection to things Fitraic perception, or we may call it deep feeling, but it's a knowledge deep within me that I have, that I can't always deduce rationally, but I know, let's call it deep feeling, I know it is real and it is true. You may recall that in the Islamic tradition, the Fitra has a long and interesting history. But one of the meanings of the Fitra is it's that natural primordial disposition within us, or nature within us, that is able to acknowledge that there is a God and worship him, and desires to worship him. And at the same time, it's an intrinsic primordial nature that is inclined towards goodness. So there is a sense in which, in the Islamic tradition, we do possess a primordial nature, and but this primordial nature hints at and indicates to us certain truths that are precise and objective, but don't fall into the category necessarily of a rational idea or something that we perceive with the eye and the ear. For example, we know the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Fitra. We are inclined and recognize the intrinsic beauty of nature through our Fitra. We are inclined towards goodness through our Fitra. Yes, we develop elaborate ethical moral systems and philosophies to further refine the complex nature of reality, or complex approach to reality. But intrinsically, our ethical moral systems are grounded in a fitraic predisposition towards goodness. We develop very elaborate schemes for producing beautiful poems and beautiful beauty in our man-made artifacts, but this is grounded in a fitraic inclination towards beauty. Likewise, and so we can and do possess this intrinsic inclination that can recognize things objectively and truthfully. So, for example, let me give you an example. No human being can be found anywhere in the world, I think, who can truthfully and honestly say that nature is ugly or repulsive. Now, you will find some individuals who are averse to some natural phenomena like the sea or forest and whatnot, and that's usually rooted in a trauma. So someone may have had a traumatic experience swimming in the ocean, or it's quite common among people who have had traumatic experiences in nature to avoid forests and whatnot. But that's secondary, and that's incidental or accidental. It's a result of a particular trauma that happened to that individual. But left to their own fitra, no person is inclined to dislike or a nature or find it ugly. Likewise, no human being is, unless there are certain circumstances that bar the development of the fitra or cover it over or distort it, naturally we're inclined towards goodness. And so the beauty of nature is something that we can objectively claim is true because everyone claims it's true. So there is a degree of objectivity there. But it's not the kind of objectivity of a rational proof necessarily, for example. It's a more of a fitraic objectivity. And so in the same way that I trust my instinct in recognizing the beauty of nature, or let's not call it instinct, let's call it fitraic perception. In the same way that I trust this deep feeling or this deep fitraic perception of the beauty of nature, likewise, that same sensibility, that same perception within me, which is rooted in the heart, of course, or deep feeling, it can act as a guide towards the refinement of producing beautiful objects. That's the same inclination that guides me towards moral goodness. It's the same inclination that inclines me towards pursuing and finding the beauty of nature. Likewise, that kind of same perception within us can guide us towards the production of beauty in things and producing a kind of beauty that is objective. We saw last week that there are two types of beauty: subjective beauty and objective beauty. Objective beauty is the kind of beauty we find in nature. And that is already deeply rooted within us. And so if we listen to that deep fitraic perception or this deep feeling, we can be guided towards producing and recognizing beauty and ugliness in a man-made world. And here we're talking about the example of architecture, for example. And so if we go back to this idea of reality being one, we can speak of a psyche-matter continuum, that there's a continuum between my internal psyche, my internal mind, and matter, or the space around me. The divine names weave the fabric of existence. Everything is a manifestation of them. And so therefore, the traces of the divine names found in nature are also found within me. And that creates a sympathetic bond between all things that are traces of the divine names. I'm connected to you and to the tree in some deep and profound sense. We're not separate objects suspended in space, but are rather, to use a more spiritual term, manifestations of a single reality. Space matter is not something out there, and the mind psyche isn't something in here, but rather the matter or psyche form a single continuum. I'm also deeply connected to the buildings that surround me. They are my habitat. In the same way that when you look at this tree, in all honesty, one can gaze at this tree for hours. And why is that the case? Well, it's because somehow the inner landscape of the soul and the outer landscape of the world mirror the same reality. I find myself in this tree in the sense that it's somehow, in its structural form, in its material, in whatever it is, I find a certain echo of a layer of my own self that I'm not always aware of, or at least not attentive to on a regular basis. And so when I encounter the natural world around me, I encounter, let's say, resonances of aspects of myself that I have forgotten because of my ghafla, my oblivious nature. And so that's how the world acts as a reminder of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala all the time. We're up to our necks drowning in the signs of God. We don't always pay attention to it, but they're there and everywhere. And so in the same way that the natural world and myself are on a continuum, likewise, I'm deeply connected to everything around me, including buildings. And so those buildings better be designed in a way that reflect an image of myself that I aspire to actualize in life, that I hope to realize my higher self in life. Better the buildings reflect that than reflect some kind of ugliness or whim or purely ego-driven desire of a particular architect. Let buildings be extensions of the living quality we find in the natural world. And so if we look at this street in the Cotswold in England, for example, there's something about the material of the buildings, the consistent height of the buildings, the variation of the buildings, but the simultaneous unity and coherence found, the age, the building's age, grace. There's something about the building that somehow, in many ways, really reflects an aspects of my existence that I miss so much. There's almost a nostalgic feel about these places, that they come from a level of reality or a realm of being that we're inclined or aspire to inhabit more regularly. These next two slides are from last week's presentations, but I thought I'd repeat them here. So when we look at these kind of natural objects or these street in the Cotswold, we get a sense in which they evince a deep feeling that somehow they image or reflect or an echo of that Fitra self we talked about earlier. And so when the world around me reflects, or when the landscape around me reflects my inner landscape of the soul, something very interesting happens. Certain trains of meditation in the mind are triggered, and that leaves profound effects within us, transforms us. And so these artifacts, as it were, as we said last week, these buildings that possess this quality of life attain such an intensity of being that it almost feels like we're stepping beyond into a boundless realm beyond the physical. It's like we're gazing beyond the configuration of the physical qualities of the object itself. They become nodes of light that shine brightest in the darkness of our existence, or founts of a divine presence that cascades down through all of creation. And so the act of building, the act of designing, is not something that is disconnected from who I am. Crafting of space, crafting of architecture, crafting of object is simultaneously a process of crafting myself. And it becomes the medium through which my inner self is realized, actualized, and discovered. If the world and I are on a continuum, if anything that is in the world affects me, whether moves me positively or moves me in the opposite direction, because there's no such thing as a neutral experience. Things in the world either enhance our happiness or increase a certain degree of anxiety. Everything in the world affects us. Of course, remember our self is extensive, or it's extended across the entire world, like a bubble extended all the way out. And so everything in the world affects us one way or another. The moment you walk into a room, the moment you walk into a building, you're immediately affected by a certain kind of mood. And so any intervention I make in the world around me is really an intervention in the self within me, because it has an effect on me. And so crafting of space, therefore, is a crafting of a particular kind of experience that the self encounters. In practical terms, this means that when I design a space, I need to be aware of the degree in which it is alive, the degree to which the space or the thing I'm making will enhance my own life. Remember Goethe's quote, life-enhancing quality, from last week. And so through cultivating these things, through design, I'm in the process of really of cultivating and crafting myself. Anyone who's ever made something with their hand knows this experience. But if you look at this courtyard, for example, in Morocco, you will see that there's a certain ambience, a certain atmospheric quality. There's a certain centeredness about it, a certain stillness that deeply and profoundly affects me, even through the picture. You remove the fountain and the entire atmospheric quality changes. You remove the arches on the edges and the boundary, and something changes. It seems to have the right and most perfect type of proportions and openings on the side, with a fountain in the middle, to create a sense of, or an image of perfection, an image of stillness, an image that deeply resonates within me. And therefore, the art of building and design is intrinsically and essentially a spiritual endeavor. And as a gift or response to the sacred in life and the transcendental, it was the hallmark of all building in the past. And we urgently need to recover this. Remember, if the world and myself exist on a continuum, imagine this continuum like a lake. Anything I do in the world outside has ripple effects within me. And that's a very profound thing to really think about. In our modern age, where we've inserted all sorts of ugliness in the cities around us, we've suffocated the possibility of experiencing the sacred, because we've created environments that, rather than lead to God, lead in the opposite direction entirely. And so, rather than the spaces around us being places that occasion and afford a deep and profound experience of God, there are spaces in which we find ourselves having to experience God in spite of them. And so this leads us to a very, very important idea. When I look at an image like this is beautiful. My statement that this is beautiful is an objective value statement. But the idea in modern culture that an objective value statement like this is actually subjective is flawed. Someone might say, I find this particular building beautiful. Someone else will say, I find it ugly. There are two value statements. As long as the beauty is grounded in subjective criteria of the architect or designer, then of course the value statements are purely subjective. But if we ground our criteria of beauty in the objectivity of the patterned, ordered and harmonious principles found in nature, then they can only be value statements that are objective. And so value is a fundamental fact of the universe. When I say this mountain and this lake, this scene is absolutely beautiful, I'm stating a fact, a value statement about the universe that is truthful. And so when it's asked, how do you feel about a design? In the architectural profession, of course, and design profession, people say, it's not something you want to ask because feeling has no role. But as we said earlier, in the heart, there is this Fitraic perception, this deep feeling, as it were, that is and can be an accurate guide for objective beauty if we choose to realign ourselves with it. One of the biggest problems in design today is designers denying their own deep feeling. Now, of course, feelings are can be quite confusing sometimes. There are sentiments and emotions, and there are feelings. Sentiments and emotions can be are really surface or superficial emotional responses to certain situations that are usually rooted in subjective or whimsical or personal preferences. Feeling, one can define feeling, as it were, or deep feeling, as the heart's capacity to feel the truth of things, but it's rooted in the fitra, and that gives it an objectivity about it. So if the fitra deems something good and beautiful, then it is good and beautiful. If psyche matter constitute a single continuum, if my inner reality and the outer world constitute a single continuum, then what I feel about it or the world around me reflects my own inner self's response to that world and how I connect to it. When I walk into I often used to do this exercise with my architectural students. We'd walk into one of these modernist, postmodern buildings, concrete slabs, and building looked like it's falling down, all sorts of different bizarre shapes. And I would ask the student, how do you feel here? And they would respond with all these interesting ideas about why the building is so brilliant. And then I would ask again, don't tell me what you think about the building. Tell me how you feel in this space. Would you sit here with a coffee and a friend and have an intimate conversation? And the response is always, they'll go back to this kind of more cerebral, rational response and say, the building is brilliant because of these ideas. And so this kind of disconnect between the world of ideas, where students are indoctrinated with a whole host of ideas about why certain kind of postmodern buildings or modernist buildings are good. And it's a complete disconnect from the way they feel. When you ask them how they feel, they get confused. How is that relevant? It's deeply and profoundly relevant. And all you have to do is really observe them. Many of them don't take their friends for a coffee to sit in one of these buildings. They actually usually end up going to some of the older buildings on campus or to enjoy. And another test of this is, it's very difficult to actually argue with people about these things, but take someone into the natural world and speak to them about objective beauty. And it might be a lot easier. All you have to do is just let them soak it in. I used to take many of my students on trips to Rome and Fez and Andalusia and other places. And rather than have intellectual arguments about why postmodern architecture is wrong, I'd let them soak in the atmospheric ambience of Rome or Venice or Fez or Granada, and they would feel a connection. They would feel things and have experiences they've never felt before. That would really deeply and profoundly transform them and connect them with the level of their own existence that they never really were connected to. So we are deeply connected to the world around us at a very fundamental and primordial sense. And we feel the ripples on the surface of the vast ocean that is our existence. However, the feeling we're talking about here is not rooted in ego, but it's an egoless feeling. It's rooted in the fitra. So sentiments and emotions can be very personal, driven by my own preferences, my own tastes, my own maybe psychological experiences. These are often rooted in my own ego. But beneath that, there is an egoless feeling, a fitraic perception that guides in this process. It's not the ego-inflated superficial feeling of many contemporary artists or architects. It's an egoless receptivity to the vibrations of the psyche matter, the plenum, the continuity between myself and the world. It's located in the heart. Let's call it the self. Let's call it the fitraic self. And what follows on from this is something quite interesting. In the actual design process, not only is value objective, but it allows us to start asking different kinds of questions. For example, when I want to build a building in a particular site, as I said last week, we either add something more beautiful to that natural site or leave it alone. And the question to ask ourselves is not what kind of postmodern idea do I want to experiment with at this particular moment, but rather survey the site, develop a deep felt connection to the site, and ask myself, how can I increase the degree of life and beauty of this particular location? And so the architect is the one who listens to things, as it were, and responds to an objective need right there at that particular point, that region of space. It is the existing built environment that hints to the designer what needs to be done. And if we align ourselves with these kind of questions, we're asking ourselves the same kind of questions that are intrinsic in the natural world. Although the mushrooms on the right-hand side don't ask these questions consciously, of course, they are nonetheless driven by a fitra, a pattern of behavior that's intrinsic to their nature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to them. And they grow out of the trunk of that tree in a way that responds immediately to the parameters, the constraints of that particular location. In the same way that the buildings on the left mushroom out of the edge of that cliff, following a similar logic. It's almost as if nature were to sprout out a number of buildings, they would look something quite similar to these particular buildings. Here you see it's a monastery in Bhutan. Not only is value objective, it's also enduring. This is a very, very crucial point. The modern process is that an architect comes into a site and erects a structure that is out of context because it's driven by an ego desire to express himself or herself. But the traditional architect, the egoless architect, did not find a building an opportunity for self-expression, but rather an opportunity to express what is, to express values that are objective, to express order, harmony, and beauty that all can agree on. It's not an egoless and lacks the spiritual discipline of what Edmund Bacon calls the principle of the second man. If you look at the image on the right-hand side, it's a traditional street in ancient Rome. The principle of the second man is a very interesting one. It suggests that if you look at the buildings, each one of those buildings there was erected in a slightly different period. And despite the centuries separating the various buildings from one another, they seem to have a coherence about them. They seem to fit together with one another, whether it's the consistency of the height of the buildings or the fenestration, the window proportions, or whether it's the variations from the lower to the upper part of the buildings. There's enough diversity to create some interest, but at the same time, enough unity to create a coherence. But these were designed over centuries. Why is it that over several centuries, a street managed to mold itself or form with this degree of harmony? Well, it's the second man principle, or the principle of the second man. And it's the idea that because these people over several centuries shared the same fundamental vision and values of beauty, goodness, coherence, and harmony, or principles of beauty rooted in the natural order, the objective order of things, no matter the centuries separating them, the principles were the same. Of course, there's a slight variation in style, of course, between this and ancient Rome, for example. But even later medieval buildings that were added into ancient Rome still have a consistency with that ancient Roman city, even with the Christian era and post-Christian era. And that is because they all subscribe to those same fundamental values of deriving the principles of beauty from the objective order of nature. This is nothing but what we call in Islam the golden principle of the silsila, or chain of transmission. Chain of transmission in Islam is when, or the silsila is when one scholar, student of knowledge, learns from a older student or a teacher or scholar, and they derive the wisdom and principles from that silsila itself. The grace of tradition is what grants every individual in this silsila a certain wisdom and a certain set of principles that transcend their own egos and transcend their own limitations. And so when we inscribe ourselves within a goal, within a silsila, we're really inscribing ourselves within a chain of people who share a certain set of values, a certain set of principles. And that's what allows the creation of order and harmony that is enduring over centuries and centuries and centuries. If every student did something radical, if every architect who came after the next architect did something radical, no city would be as coherent as this one. And if every student of knowledge came and did something radically different from their master, there would be no continuity of knowledge through the centuries. In a chain of transmission, all egos are subdued or submit to the grace and wisdom of tradition. Only the Fitraic self is called into action. When one submits one ego to the grace of tradition and the principles and wisdoms handed down through tradition, a certain coherence is created over time, over long periods of time, like the coherence defined in many ancient cities and towns. And what is called into action is not the temporal ego self of the individual that's bound to the particular circumstances of the whims and desires of that particular individual, but rather what is opened up, what is called into action, what is activated in this process is the Fitraic self and its turn towards the absolute and eternal principles of beauty and order. And so what we really need, what we urgently need is to restore and recover our traditional cosmology, which with the kind of requirements of our modern age will be both a traditional and new cosmology at the same time. In architectural language, we say it's to give the future, the gift. We need to give a future to the past. We need to give a future to the past. The past and its values are not dead. They are extremely relevant in our modern age. The question is, how can we re-articulate it in a language that we can understand today? So this ends the formal part one of this presentation. Last week was half, and this is the other half. In the next 2 or 3 weeks, inshallah, I'll continue what I promised to do last week, and that is to turn towards the material cause, the formal cause, and the efficient cause of architecture. We already discussed the final cause in the first lecture last week, inshallah. So right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing and bring up, hopefully, the list of questions that have been building up, hopefully, throughout this session. Okay. Bismillah. I don't seem to see any new questions. Okay, I'm not sure if I can, I'm able to see the questions. Okay, here we are. So in your second lecture, you speak of natural realities and nested realities. How do we comprehend in a holistic manner any artificial realities that we seek to design? How do we comprehend in a holistic manner That's an interesting question. I'm still divided, or I'm still discovering myself the nature of AI and virtual realities. I am inclined to think that any experiences that leave our bodily existence behind can be extremely dangerous to our capacity to perceive things naturally. We are, at the end of the day, beings that are embodied with a body, mind, and soul. And so our most fundamental natural experiences are ones that are rooted in this reality, in our body. When we escape from the body into the realm of artificial images, there is a deep and profound danger there. And to be honest with you, we're still discovering the full implications of what that actually entails. So I can't really give you a full answer right now, but I'll definitely try to think about it and try to give us some kind of measured response by next week, inshallah. The idea of things being deeply connected reminds of the analogy last Ramadan of reality constructed like a rug. Is there anything explicit in the Quran or Hadith literature that speaks of the interconnectedness of things? Well, one of the interesting things about these types of questions that I find is we live in an age in which so much of what was implicitly understood in the past has to be explicitly articulated. And in an age before our modern period, for example, where it was almost unthinkable to destroy nature, you won't find a lot of literature on necessarily the preservation of nature in the sense that we understand it today. Or in a world in which, in the previous pre-modern age, in a world in which atheists didn't really exist in large numbers, or they existed only as individuals, there wasn't a culture of atheism. It's very difficult to find in pre-modern literature, including Islamic literature, a lot of stuff that can address these challenges and problems of atheism today. And so what I'm getting at is that today we search for connectedness to nature because we've become so radically disconnected. This has never happened in human history before. And so although the Quran does not explicitly talk and say you are intimately interconnected with everything in nature, it didn't need to, because implicitly this is something that was never questioned before the modern age. Never questioned at all. However, having said that though, every single Quranic verse and the very idea of reality consisting, or the nature of reality consisting of divine names, etc., suggests, of course, that this interconnected exists. The very idea of Tawheed suggests interconnectedness. Many thinkers, whether it's philosophers or Sufis, are not inventing things necessarily that are new. They're just drawing out consequences and implications of their understanding of Tawheed in more and more detailed form, and sometimes drawing out the implications for an age that needs it. So today, for example, we do need, let's say, a theology of the built environment, and we need a theology of nature. We didn't do this before the modern age. Why? Because we didn't need a theology of the natural world, because we weren't at odds with it. And we didn't need a theology of the built environment because we weren't producing the kind of ugliness that we see in the modern world. And therefore, we weren't generating the kind of problems that are associated with ugly cities and monstrous cities, etc., etc. So we've got to be really careful about these issues and questions, because you often hear some Muslims say, if it hasn't been explicitly mentioned in the Quran, then it's a bid'ah. But it's not entirely the case at all. I completely disagree with that kind of understandings. what is the basic contribution of Islamic values and principles to the architecture beyond period and urban planning in general to support good livelihood and functionality? I don't think I understand the question. In terms of recommendations, I will suggest recommendations. There is one I'm going to link. I'm going to link what I've been saying in the next two or three talks to individual authors and architects. There are a few brilliant minds out there writing, so I will do that in the next week or so when the topics actually come up and arise, inshallah. I think that's all of it for today. I don't see any more questions, inshallah. If there are any other questions, inshallah, we can address them as we did this week, address them at the end of session next week, inshallah, when we talk about the materiality of architecture, or the very material in which we use to build things and make things. So we'll leave it at that, inshallah. اللهم أرنا الحق حقا وارزقنا اتباعه وأرنا الباطل باطلا وارزقنا اجتنابه وصلى اللهم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.